Alrighty, guys. As far as I can tell, this is going to be the first show of its kind, and we are very lucky to have all three of the gentlemen we've got joining us. I am just thoroughly excited. Um, we've got Mr. Phil Phillips, Mr. Frank Doherty, who were 219th Headhunters SPAF attached to CCC. They're going to lay out some of the history of the 219th, which is going to be absolutely outstanding. And guys, if you do not know, Mr. Frank has a book out about his time flying visual reconnaissance for CCC, and his backseater is joining us today, a prior guest, Mr. Michael Buckland, and the Amazon link to this is in the show notes. So guys, please hop over there and get this. It is outstanding. I've got it, and I did not stop reading until early this morning when I was found passed out in the chair. So without further ado, I'm ready to start hearing about this. Gentlemen, who would like to kick us off for today?
Go ahead, Mike.
Okay, to begin with, it's useful to understand that with special forces, everything is very secret. It's not like a lot of other organizations that are jumping up and down saying, take our picture, take our picture. There is a saying that's common in special forces that says, you must be mistaken. We were never there. And so much of what's done in the Green Berets is so deniable. So when it comes to something like SOG, it is difficult to imagine how unique the SOG MACV Studies and Observation Program, how unique it was, and how important the SPAF effort was. Now, SPAF was the name that Green Berets gave to the pilots that were attached at CCC, and SPAF was Sneaky Pete Air Force. And so the Sneaky Pete was just a term always used on the dark side for people who did secret activities for America. And these guys were unique. SOG was set up in an unusual way, to say the least, because the American war effort in Vietnam was run by something called MACV, Military Assistance Command Vietnam. It had an obscure branch called SOG, and that was the MACV Studies and Observation Group. It was a set of pipe-smoking historians. Their job, supposedly, was to study and document the lessons learned from the conduct of the Vietnam War. And it was boring. Journalists paid no attention to a military history group. But that is where that became the locus of the black operations for the Vietnam War. And so there were three units, of course, CCN up at Da Nang, CCC, where we were at Kontum, and CCS down in the Red Clay District at Bami Tuat. And SOG was set up so uniquely that there was a bird colonel in Saigon called Chief SOG. And they were pretty remarkable commanders. They answered not to the commander in Vietnam, Westmoreland and later Abrams. They answered instead directly to something called SINCPAC, which was Commander-in-Chief Pacific. This was a four-star admiral in Honolulu at Pearl. And he answered for these purposes to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington. Beyond him, you had only the Secretary of Defense and the president. So these men, when they were off doing the photo intel flights on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, this was extremely important. A lot of the information came out, and it would be viewed sometimes by the Secretary of Defense, by even the president, and people like SecDef, Robert McNamara. So it was a very unusual program, and I can't say enough about the valor and the expertise of the Snaky Pete Air Force. I was a Special Forces sergeant. I had run recon with RT Maine, separate issue there. I had been on A Company of the Hatchet Force. I now was running the photo intelligence program in the photo lab for what we did, which was called Operation Ford Drum. And that was just one part, but an important part of what people like Frank and Phil did. So again, I was with these men on many missions against the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And when you went out each day, kind of a dawn patrol thing, you literally, the Russians had gone all out with also Chinese communist support. They had given the North Vietnamese army some of the finest equipment in the world. It was for research and development. They wanted to see how many American aircraft they could shoot out of the sky with their finest anti-aircraft systems. And so when these guys took to the air and flying low level on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, you did not know whether you were going to get home that day or not. You also were operating every flight in an environment where, let's say that you had an oil pressure problem. Phil and I, by the way, had an oil pressure problem one day, and we ended up landing on a highway in country. Do you remember this, Phil?
Yes.
Yeah. And so we were there, and Phil was trying to get his bird dog back in operation. And I was there with my car 15 trying to make sure that nobody killed either of us that happened along. Fortunately, nobody hostile did. But had that happened over the border, that would have been just a simple engine failure would have been a desperately serious situation. And those were the risks that these pilots from the 219th flew. By the way, Bud, you probably have the photo where I'm leaning against a bird dog. And on my left shoulder, I'm wearing a 219th aviation recon patch, because the one thing you did not want to do if you fell into enemy hands was be associated with special forces. That's it. The patch there that I'm wearing for the photo flights, my cover was I was going to be a new pilot assigned to the 219th, and I was just getting checked out, and I didn't know very much. Anyway, these guys are absolute American heroes. And to put in a quick plug for Bud, he is already making a name for himself as one of the standout historians that are dedicated to showcasing the contributions of S.O.G. Remember, this is the group of military historians that never left an office, but it was a center of black ops. And these two men you're seeing, Phil Phillips and Frank Doherty, they probably more than any of the other pilots that I can think of really were there day in and day out. I don't know why you two were always flying the most dangerous missions, but I just expected it. It was going to be one of the two of you. Usually Doherty and I were put together. So that's more than you needed to hear from me, but I cannot tell your listeners just how brave these men and the other SPAFs were, and the risks they ran day in and day out, and the up before dawn and getting back at dusk. That's a hard thing to do 7 days a week. They did have a pretty good program where they tried not to assign these guys flight duties more than 7 days a week. That was one of the limitations. And like Frank, did he ever complain about that? Well, every flight. Yes. No, you didn't. Okay, so that's a little about SPAF, but it's also useful to understand that every CNC unit was given tremendous latitude to organize itself as they needed to, and only Command and Control Central, which was up in the mountains in beautiful Kon province, it was a French provincial area, and we were up there, and the CIA was up there. And I know Frank and Phil used to go over, we all did sometimes, at the CIA compound in Khartoum. And there was some cooperation, rivalry. But that's a question a lot of people used to ask is, why didn't the CIA have command of these things? And it actually goes back to the Kennedy era. This right here is in the CIA compound. And you see, I don't know, it appears to be a set of junior high school age people. We were young once and soldiers. Take it away, Frank and Phil.
Go ahead,
Okay.
Phil.
The other person in that photo you just showed was Doug Kraut, and he was also a SPAF pilot. And Doug lives in Colorado. Don't hear much from him these days, but I personally am going to get him down to Salida, Colorado, where I live most of the time, and have him go through the book and reminisce on some things. But first, I'll give you a little background about the 219th. The 219th came to Vietnam in 1965. It's when it was activated out of Fort Hood. Believe it or not, there were 5,000 original members of the 219th, pilots, crew chiefs, command staff, cooks, maintenance people, all of that. And they were headquartered at Camp Holloway at Pleiku. And there were 13 locations initially for the 219th. And then by the time I left country, I think they were down to 4 or 5 locations. It was the largest bird dog unit in Vietnam, period. There was 4 platoons when I was there. And I was originally assigned to the 3rd platoon at Camp Holloway. And Frank will appreciate what I'm going to say here. I think I flew with the 3rd platoon for maybe 3 weeks or so, might have been a month. Their mission was to support the 52nd Artillery. And since I had graduated from OCS prep school at Fort Sill, Oklahoma as a fire direction control specialist, I knew how to register an artillery battery, adjust artillery, and all that kind of stuff. So they sent me to the 3rd platoon there at Camp Holloway, and I flew missions with an artillery lieutenant in my back seat, adjusting and registering batteries and doing convoy coverage and this and that. And I was absolutely frickin' bored to tears. And I think Frank was feeling the same way when he was down there with the 4th platoon. And so I was looking for a way out of the, I was looking for a way to get away from the flagpole. I was offered the opportunity to go up to Khartoum and fly with the 2nd platoon, which had 2 sections. One section worked for MACV in country, and the other section worked for CCC. So I flew with the in-country section for, I don't know, maybe a month. Flew with Brian Richards and Doug Kraut and George Aiken and a couple of other guys. And then I was offered the opportunity to fly the CCC mission. And I think it was John Myers who probably coached me to come over and do some real flying. And it was strictly a voluntary mission. And it was a top secret mission. You had to get a special clearance, and you had to sign the form that if you talk to anybody about it, you might have a nice paid vacation at Leavenworth or something like that. So, like Mike Buckland said, it was pretty secret operation, and we were busy a lot. And just so you know, the 219th was deactivated, I think, in December 1971. By that time, I was back for another tour flying otters. But anyway, that's my introduction, and I'll turn it over to Frank and let him talk a little bit about himself.
Well, I was bored to tears flying otters and at a Da Nang. And so I asked for a transfer. And after they got done yelling at me, they sent me up to the 219th. I was offered the 2nd platoon right off the bat by on ship. And I took it because they didn't have any extra duties. And I didn't want to do anything else. I just wanted to fly. So I went up to the 219th, and I had to stay down in Holloway for about 2.5 weeks, getting an in-country orientation and flying the bird dog, because I hadn't flown one since I left Rucker. I'd been flying otters, and that's when I got introduced to CCC. And Ship said, "I've got you. I need you to go do this thing." And I said, "What is it?" And he said, "I don't know, but you're going to go out to a place called Duco, and they'll tell you what to do from there." So next thing you know, I'm trying to get a team okay out over Cambodia, and all of a sudden I'm not doing anything in country. I'm doing this every day for CCS, and then that's the southern bunch of guys. I finally got up to Khartoum and got my briefing, and I realized that I probably wasn't going to be flying in Vietnam again for quite a while, and I didn't. We flew in Laos. We, for the most part, flew in Cambodia. That's where I met Phil. That's where I met John Myers, who was nuts, and Doug Kraut, and Michael, who's also nuts. He just sounds very professorial, but it was just a different kind of thing, and you just flew all day, and you just put one foot in front of the other, and if you let your mind dwell on the kind of thing that you were going to do, you probably wouldn't go. But you said you would. We volunteered, so it's kind of hard to back out. You can't just say, I don't feel like doing this. I don't know that the Army understands that part, but I think that I absolutely loved doing this thing, and I think that I'm so fortunate to have been able to fly with guys like Phil and Doug and Jerry Ford and John Myers, and spend time talking to Mike, which I think we talked more after we both came back from Vietnam, especially in the last couple of years, because without Mike, I would have been hard pressed to figure a lot of things out about this book. He was a marvelous resource for me, and I can't thank him enough. So that's what I did, and I will never regret 1 minute of that mission and those days and that year, ever. I would never regret it. It just changes you in amazing ways, makes you far more introspective and far more loving of life. That's my.
Now, for some of the viewers, it may help them to realize the importance of S.O.G, which was so super secret. Special Forces already had conducted a secret war in Laos. It was called Operation White Star. And these were the older guys that had done it. And it was the total destruction of the Pathet Lao, the communist insurgency. They intended to start in Laos, not in Vietnam. But because White Star had been so successful at the destruction of the communist insurgency there, Kennedy built up the SF presence in Vietnam. The entire 5th Special Forces Group was activated there to take over for that. But S.O.G, which virtually no one in Vietnam knew even existed, except as a tiny office of military historians, if they ever looked at an organization chart, it had reached the point where it was tying down about 40 to 50,000 of the best NVA infantry troops to the defense of the trail. And the penalty that was being paid was for 3 years running, S.O.G took over 100% casualty rates. This is by far the highest sustained loss rate of any American unit since the Great War between the states. And it was a great feat keeping this secret. Well, what was happening, we were losing teams. Over a dozen teams were just, they vanished totally. They were never heard from again, operating on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And so the losses were becoming so terrible, then they wanted to try, by the way, this is RT Maine, the team I was on. We're up at Dak To at the famous launch site. The canvas covered wooden building in the background, that was where the bright light team stayed for a week at a time. And during the big fight of the 173rd Airborne at Dak To, that was their morgue building. So when you were up at Dak To for a week of bright light, you actually slept in a morgue, which was kind of an interesting thing. And mostly people stayed away from it for that reason from other people at Dak To. But that's what you're seeing there is a sterile SOG team headed out for a mission in Laos. But Fort Drum was put together as a means of trying to do from the air at low level and high risk photo intelligence missions that might eliminate the need for the targeting of a SOG recon team with all of the attendant casualties. And that meant that the SPAF pilots, these rascals that you're looking here, they're also known as unindicted co-conspirators, I'm sure. But, and Phil, I don't know if we'll even get into the appropriation of a MAC-V Jeep, but that was your claim to, I know Frank will not let you escape without the Grand Theft Auto appellation being explained. But what these men were doing was tremendously important because when you tied down 40 to 50,000 of their best infantry on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, this is like 4 divisions at least that could not fight in South Vietnam, killing American and South Vietnamese soldiers. So it's a safe thing to bet that thousands of American troops got to go home alive because of an organization they never heard about. And some of the teams that weren't lost, weren't wiped out, were because of the valiant flight efforts of these rascals here. So I can't say enough about the Sneaky Pete Air Force and the amazing job they did, but everyone lived and breathed secrecy. So I was probably, because I did a lot of different things from recon to hatchet force to photo intel and such, I probably got to know a lot more of the overall puzzle. And at one point, a quick vignette, they sent me down to MAC-V Saigon that had a very nice photo lab. And they said, the S2 major said, Buckland, they believed in good training. He said, listen, here's the deal. We're giving you a week of advanced training. We have had one of the finest photographers in the entire US military brought to Saigon, and he will teach you for a week, OJT. He'll have no other duty than to teach you. So go down there. You are just simply, your cover story is you shoot awards and decorations, photographs at very boring things. He will not know anything about SOG, although he will be there for a week, guarded carefully. But you and he are, and he was a gray-haired photographer, a master at his field. So I went down there, and they hadn't really coordinated the cover stories well enough because this award-winning military photographer, I shook his hand and I said, Sergeant so-and-so, never mind his name. He was from Eastern Europe originally. I said, yeah, I'm just a low-level photographer. I shoot awards and decoration ceremonies, photos, up country, very boring stuff. And so that's what I do. And this old guy looked at me and he just said, that's interesting. You have a very boring life, don't you, Sergeant Buckland? I said, yes, I do. He says, well, all I know is I was told I'll do 10 years in prison if I ever tell anyone I ever met you. So there must be some awards and decoration ceremonies. All I'm saying is SOG was absolutely serious about secrecy, and what the Fort Drum project was put together for these men to fly at tremendous risk to their lives. It was designed to try and reduce the staggering. It was already past 100%. When you went in for SOG duty, you knew that a Purple Heart was waiting. I got one. Everybody that I went there with did. The majority of the men that I went there with ended up being killed in SOG ops. But what happened in a system like that, and all the last comment is, as people were being killed, I lost track of how many bird dogs got blown out of the sky over there in the Secret War, the mission that these guys ran. A lot of bird dogs got shot down, and they didn't always find the people that had been in them, but they saved a lot of lives. That's the takeaway. And no American failure at the Pentagon level to prosecute anything to its logical end takes away the fact that a whole lot of Americans and South Vietnamese got to live their lives because of men like Phil and Frank and Doug and John and the others. So thank you so much for what you men did. Thank you.
I would say that.
Well, I got to tell you. Go ahead.
No.
What Mike said, had I known that there were 50,000 or so NVA troops along the trail, watching us, watching them, I'm not sure I would have volunteered for that mission. But it was what it was, and we did what we did, and we all came home. We were lucky and probably pretty good at what we did. And I have to give kudos to Mike because he flew my backseat quite often. And we flew the low-level Fort Drum missions, and he had his Pentax camera with the motor drive unit and the telescopic lens. And we got some pretty good pictures along the trail of people and bridges and hooches and trucks and bulldozers on the trail and this and that. And it was one of those missions to where if you kept your wits about you, you could stay alive. If you got too careless, and some did and some didn't come home, and some were smart and good and didn't come home because there was a lot of AA out there. And we did lose some bird dogs in Laos and Cambodia. But Frank and I and Doug and Jerry Ford and John Myers and Pete Johnston and there was one other that I remember. I can't think of his name right now, but we came home and some didn't, and that's the way it was.
Mm-hmm.
I think that Jason asked an interesting question about the difference between what we did and what drones are doing. And the principal difference is that I'm sitting here talking to Phil and Bud and Mike, and drones aren't. We're relating history to things that we did, and the drones don't do that. They record, but they don't experience. And I think something that touches you, like this mission certainly touched us, is totally different than the mechanical operation of a little drone. Does it take the photographs? Yes. Does it live through taking the photographs? Well, not exactly. I think that, as Phil said, had I known that there were 50,000 NVA out there along that trail, I'm not so sure I would have gone either. But the truth is, I never really knew what we were doing. I just did it because Buckland said do it, so I did. And that was the nature of how we operated. It was almost better to know a whole hell of a lot less about what was going on than a great big picture. I'm not so sure I would have wanted to know it. I was very content to get up and go and do what I was supposed to do and think about what I was doing. And that way I could compartmentalize what I was doing and hone in on this very specific mission. I didn't want a lot of stuff cluttering up what I was trying to accomplish. I didn't want to have to do too much thinking about the mission. Just go do it, and do it carefully. Think about the specific operation of what you were doing, and try to come home, try to live.
Well, Mike said it. Mike said it a little earlier, about the secrecy and everything. I didn't know much about the job when I took it. And quite frankly, I think the intel people at CCC probably consciously did not tell us a lot about the operation and the significance and the importance of it and where our intel was going and how it was all working. Because if we ever went down and got captured, that would be devastating to the SOG mission. And so I knew what I knew. I got my briefings from the intel people. It was a day-to-day operation. We'd go out and put a team in, stay in communication with them. We had several teams in on the ground at most any time. Mike could tell you about how many, but it seems like I remember like maybe 2 or 3 teams on the ground at any time when I was out there flying. And we maintained contact with them. We put them in, we covered them. And if they needed an extraction, which was called a spare 3-9er, we would call for it and get them out of there. And when those things happened and the team got out safely, we felt like that we had really done our jobs. And I do know that a lot of the team members and the Mountain Yard fighters that were on the teams got wounded during those recon missions. Some of them got killed. And but it always gave me a great deal of satisfaction to get a team in safely and communicate with them, know that they were safe for 8 or 10 days while they were in the field, and then get them out and then start all over again.
Something. Sorry.
I'm sorry, Mr. Mike. I wanted to ask Mr. Phil one thing because, excuse me, guys. I've actually mentioned this because, again, guys, another shameless plug. If you do not have this book and you can afford it, there are people gouging. Do not pay in the multiples of hundreds for this. But if you can find a reasonable copy, I recommend you get it because it is not only full of wonderful photos and pictures, but it is a lot of information. There's a whole section on the Sneaky Pete Air Force. And I was curious because I made a post trying to share a little bit about y'all before I even met Mr. Frank and Mr. Mike. But I came across the emergency spare 3-9er. Is that what you said? Was that correct? Okay, I shared that and had never heard that and caught some flack from men up north saying they've never heard this or that. Was that, and is that a central thing? Is that what y'all use? And of course, North wouldn't know anything about that, but was that the standard emergency troops in contact thing, spare 3-9er or need to extract?
I'll let Mike answer that question because the three command and control operations probably had different code words for different things.
And they were kept compartmentalized for a reason. Something that's worth noting about, MACV did pretty effective intelligence work overall. And the American intelligence in Vietnam had access to a whole lot of enemy communications and such. As John Plaster in his standout work, S.O.G, The Secret Wars documents, using the NVA figures, not American estimates, for every American Green Beret that was killed in S.O.G operations, at a minimum, there were 700 NVA that were killed. There has never been a loss rate like that in any American war. I don't know if there's been one like that in any war that we could find. And it was the air support that made it possible. And what these men did was astonishing. And so with regard to what Phil was saying, what kept you alive as much as anything and this came hard for young men, was the lesson, as a gray-haired SF sergeant told me when I was a newbie there. He just said, listen, you want to live through this? I got 2 words: pay attention. And whether you lived or you died depended in so many cases on paying attention, because it was the little things that would get people. And you just, does that make sense, Phil, Frank, that the importance?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, I gotta make one more comment too. That book that Frank Greco wrote, it's called Running Recon. And it is a pricey book. You can find it on Amazon, and it's well written, well documented, and extremely over 700 pages, and there's a ton of photographs in there. And for anybody that's interested in the SOG mission, yeah, I would recommend owning that book, or maybe checking it out at the library if you can find one. It's called Running Recon by Frank Greco. And Frank rode my back seat a couple of times, and we had some fairly interesting experiences. Anyway, he was a great backseater. And Mike Buckland, I give him credit for helping to keep me alive, because he knew the trail better than any SPAF pilot, because he had been over there. I think, Mike, I think you were on your 3rd tour when you were flying with us.
Yeah.
He knew the territory. He knew he knew to tell us, don't fly around the bra. That's not a good place to go. And a couple of other things too. When the war in Vietnam was starting to spool down in 70 and 71, the activities along the Ho Chi Minh Trail were spooling up. Because of some of the politics in the USA. There were bombing halts and Christmas truces and this and that, and the trail wasn't getting bombarded, back in the day. And then in 71 and 72, and there was activity on the trail even up around 73. Of course, we weren't there then, but the trail got busier later in the war. And Frank and I were flying I was flying it in 69, and Frank was flying in 70 and probably 71 as well. And not sure what we're looking at there, but
that's Frank Greco.
Oh, that's Frank. I didn't recognize him without his boonie hat.
Archie, Colorado.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
He's the one who
Colorado,
trained
that's
me
correct.
for photo work, by the way. I took over the photo lab from Frank personally.
Wow.
And to give you an idea of how zany things were, Cambodia was tremendously important to the war effort. It was headed up by Prince Norodom Sihanouk. And he came and he went according to what coup was underway and what the CIA was doing in Cambodia and Laos and probably New Jersey, who knew. But one day I was called in on a very secret briefing, and they said, look, SOG Intel has determined that Sihanouk is active again, and he is meeting with the North Vietnamese, some generals, at a location, a very remote site they think is secure. They think we won't know about this. It is in Cambodia, in a small town. And we know the building that Sihanouk will be in with the North Vietnamese generals. He said, what is desired is something we could wax him if we wanted to. We don't. We want to intimidate him. He thinks he can do this secretly. We want to show them that we are watching everything that he does. We watch his summer palace and such. I could tell you about bird dog missions onto Sihanouk's beautiful summer palace in Cambodia on a dollar-shaped lake. Anyway, they said, here, this is where it will be. Is there something that SPAF can do to intimidate the snot out of the effective ruler of Cambodia? And so we put together a 2-ship mission. Doherty and I were on the bottom one. I said, look, here's the deal, Frank. They're going to be in a building. It's like a little pagoda building, and it's on a country town, but it's a beautiful building. You may have the photos from this with you there. And I said, now, we'd like to fly down that street. There's the building that they were at. And this was picked because it was beautiful, but nobody would know anyone was meeting there. And you see in between the two buildings, that is what we had to fly a bird dog down. Right there. And the idea was simply to do a low-level pass below the rooftop at almost street level and just let them know, SOG is watching. Do not think we're not aware of what you are doing, selling out your country and Southeast Asia to the North Vietnamese. So, Frank, you could probably describe a little about what it was like to fly down there. And I remember the discussion basis, do you think they'll have any communications wires across the street? And I said, I don't know, but I think we're going to find out. This is the photo that I took going by. And you realize we're passing fairly quickly, as much as you can do anything quick in a bird dog, because by military law, wherever you go in an otter or a bird dog, you're required to take a lunch. That's okay. That's an Irish fact, not true. But can you imagine what it was like flying down here? And this was a photo. They were meeting in this room. And for all they knew, we could have seen all the way inside. Frank, any recollections about that day? And Phil was probably in the high bird, not far above us.
I think that there were times when I was really terrified, and this was one of them. And I had no idea. Nobody told me why we were doing this. We just went and did it. So again, the level of secrecy was incredible, but I looked back at him and I thought, you really are trying to kill me. You just set out trying to kill me. So it was another day. It was another weird thing that they asked us to do, and they asked us to do a lot of weird things, and that was one of them. Mm-hmm. Show up, go do what you're supposed to do, come home, drink a beer.
Yeah.
Hope for the best. And when he told me he was in there, but so much of this stuff, so much of what we're talking about today were things that I found out much later in my life. I mean, I was flying for the airline when we had these discussions about what Ford Drum was, and I remember specifically asking you, what was it? And you proceeded then to explain bits and pieces at a time, because it was an awful lot to take in. Mm-hmm. That day was just surreal. Mm-hmm. Hi, Prince. Nice talking to you.
Well, on a given day, you could be told to report to the S2 Major there in Kontum, and you'd have to realize CCC and the other installations, they were not American installations. They didn't have a U.S. flag. They had a Vietnamese flag only, and that was for a reason, so that it wouldn't draw attention. We were supposedly a Vietnamese unit, never mind whether all these SF guys there. But you could be told to report to the S2 Major, and they were very competent people, usually. Sometimes the S3. We won't get into a certain major that was a pain in the neck, because in any organization, you always have your 3% that you wish weren't there. I don't care what the organization is. But one day you'd be called in and they'd say, okay, you remember the photos that you guys did a week ago? I said, well, which flight? He said, well, this particular one, and it was in this location and such. He says, anyway, SecDef was very impressed with those, and he took them to the White House, and they'd like you to do more like that. Because when the president sees the pictures of the war on the ground, he's very interested in this. This is different than people just doing briefings and such. So you didn't always know who saw what, but sometimes you would find out that they were going to very, very interesting places because they wanted to know. Satellite imagery from above tells you some things. For example, the hospital that was struck in Gaza. It was photo intel imagery that showed this was not an Israeli strike at all. But it was skillful photo imagery. It just showed no, somebody blew internally there. And this is the importance of this, and people who spend their lives with these things. But a lot of times we didn't really get to know the outcome because everyone was so secret all the time about everything. But anyway, there were some fun times. That's the other thing we ought to think about too, is that this sounds very grim and dangerous and whatever, only because it was. But we had a heck of a lot of fun too, didn't we?
It's a good group of guys for sure.
Yeah.
And they, you know what, they partied hard. And, you know, I enjoyed after a mission, you know, you get back to CCC, the mess hall is closed. You're eating C rations and you say, hey, let's go over to the club and have a beer. And sometimes you had to open that door once and close it before you went in because some fool with a crossbow in there would shoot the door.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't remember who that was that played that little game, but
Sounds like Tom Wascovich
or Glasshauser or one of those.
or
Could be.
Mr. Frank.
But we had a good group of people in there, and you know, Tiger running the bar, and the beer was always cold, and the camaraderie was always great. It was not a big club, just a hole in the wall type of place, and that was back in the days when Major Jacks was had his quarters behind the little club there.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't remember who it was, Bucky. You might remember. Somebody came in and shot up the club one day, and one of the bullets went through the wall and shattered Major Jackson's toilet. Who did that?
Was it Wilson?
Nobody would really admit to anything like that. Usually the first suspect, though, was either Glasshauser or Phillips from the SPAF.
No.
You know.
There's Jax.
Yeah. He was Czech, by the way, and he was lucky not to be a canceled Czech because of his background. In Special Forces, we had a lot of Eastern Europeans. We even had some people who had been SS officers during the war, although they were more, they'd usually been killed by the time that we were there. But our 10th Special Forces group out of Bad Tolz, Germany, had entire teams that were very fluent in Czech, in Romanian, in Russian, whatever. The first group on Okinawa with the Yellow Flash had teams who were completely country qualified and linguistically qualified for any Asian target. The 8th group in Panama had them all across Latin America. And I think most people don't realize what Special Forces is because it's such a secret organization. It's not one of the ones that's jumping up and down saying, take our picture, take our picture. It's quite the opposite.
Weren't most of these men that you're speaking of, some of these Eastern Europeans, the Dead A's, some of the men that became colonels that led y'all in SF, weren't they Lodge Act veterans or Lodge Act soldiers?
Exactly. And they'd proven themselves. But I'm still in the First Church of Special Forces. I think this is something that America did really well. And it's just a lot of what's been done with it. How to put it? One of the lessons that came out of SOG, where we were having to kind of beg, borrow, and steal aviation support in the 3 different units. One of the great lessons of SOG in the Vietnam War was the extreme need to have completely dedicated aviation support for special operations. Because when out of CCC, when Operation Tailwind was run, It was a deep penetration. It was to go into the headquarters, the enemy headquarters for the entire Cambodian region. And they'd put it, they thought, out of reach of the helicopters we normally used, the King Bees, the Slicks. So we needed CH-34s. We needed Jolly Greens. And the Marines had them. And from the Pentagon that came down, you will support an SF strike on a very important target against COSVN, the COSVN, the headquarters for it. And the Marine commander said, only if they can guarantee that the landing zones will be secure. Well, on the heart of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, this was nonsense, of course. So the proper assurances were given for Operation Tailwind, and they ordered Marine Jolly Green Giants to take hatchet force from CCC in. It was a tremendously successful operation. They went into the headquarters. They basically killed everybody in the headquarters. They had special equipment. They took the filing cabinets out of their intelligence headquarters and loaded them. But by the time they were done, the Marines that had never lost a Jolly Green and never wanted to, they had 3 of them shot down on Tailwind. They never quite forgave us that you said this would be a completely safe operation. And so, well, you shouldn't have believed us, should you? So it was a pretty amazing thing SOG did, but everything about it depended on these valiant aviators. And sometimes there were people that just, like there's a Slick pilot. The Slick is a troop-carrying Huey helicopter. There's a guy that flew Slicks for CCC, Jim Lake, that I talked to after the war. And I said, Jim, you knew how dangerous the mission was supporting SOG. Why did aviators volunteer for it? So I've got my eye. And he said, well, you'd have to realize in country, you had a lot of stupid things that were going on, stupid regulations, stupid policies. And you had people, field grade officers who shouldn't have been commanding anything. And they were sometimes getting people killed. They were getting aviators killed with their silly policies. He says, the word was out, something was going on with special forces, and it was very dangerous. But if you went there, everything would be professionally done. And he said, from the first launch site briefing, he says, I can tell you, everything was absolutely professionally done in SOG. We reported in for the day's missions, and they'd have a briefing team there that says, gentlemen, we have 3 teams on the ground. We have another one that's going in. SOG was tasked in the 3 contingents, north, south, central, to try and keep 40 to 50 American Special Forces soldiers on the ground in Laos and Cambodia at a time. An answer to Phil's, yeah, we usually had about 3 teams going. Past that, if all 3 got in trouble at once, it was a nightmare beyond calculation. And sometimes that happened because the aviation resources that these men had through Hillsborough. In other words, we were given, when we went into SOG, we were given a set of code words that were very, very secret. And they said, look, if you know this code word, you can basically commandeer air assets. If you want B-52s en route from Guam at other targets, you can order them retargeted. No one will question you if you know these code names, etc. They also could be done through Hillsborough, the C-130 that was circling. So everything was about air support to try and get this done. And I think probably the aviators were just as important as the SF people that were doing this. Sorry, I've got to get a Kleenex.
Would y'all like to well, Mr. Phil, after you, would you guys like to take a few questions after you finish up, Mr. Phil?
Oh, sure.
I'm gonna give a couple of other guys a little thumbs up here. Mike was talking about the Tailwind operation, and that was after I had already left. So 2 of our SPAFs that came later, Jerry Ford, Charles J. Ford, and Dave Teague, they both flew that tailwind mission, and it was a pretty a scary mission. And I could be wrong on this, but Mike, was that not up around the golf course area and maybe Dollar Lake? Isn't that where tailwind took place?
I'm trying to think where it was in Cambodia. It was
No, that would have been Laos.
Yes, sir. It was in
I'll ask Jared.
Laos, sorry. Yeah.
northern Laos.
It
I'll
was
get the map
southern
up.
Laos, somewhere up near Dollar Lake, and there was an area up there that was not heavy jungle. It was a fairly large area called, and the nickname for it among the SOG guys was the golf course.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a part of the trail where the enemy would often be exposed if you could find them moving. Of course, we were flying mostly during the daytime, and the Cubbies and the Nails and other facts would do the night missions, and a lot of times they found troops and trucks and whatever moving at night and brought in air assets. And another quick thing, Sneaky Pete Air Force, the SPAF. Frank and I and all of the SPAFs, we were Army pilots, and I think everybody knows that by now. But so Sneaky Pete Air Force was just kind of a nickname, and but we were all Army bird dog pilots, and we were Sneaky Pete's because the Special Forces guys had been calling themselves Sneaky Pete's for years, and so we were just the air assets that supported them, so they called us Sneaky Pete Air Force.
Okay, people have been wanting me to find out about that for quite some time, and I didn't know if y'all had a guy in the group named Pete that y'all just gave him the honor, or if y'all were just Sneaky Pete's, and that's nice to know now.
Sneaky Pete was the sub rosa or secret activities, which are called black ops. White ops are ones that can be openly acknowledged. Gray ops are, they're not necessarily focused on, but no one denies it. Black ops are where you do the things that are never done by your country because your country would not do these things. And SOG did a lot of black ops. I mean, there were things like recon teams. When you found weapons caches and ammunition caches on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, of course you could blow them up. What does that accomplish? They'll just bring in others. And said we had programs like Italian Green and Soap Chips, where we would photograph what they had there, and the next team that would be targeted in would put in special ammunition. It looked absolutely, it came from the CIA labs in Okinawa. And it was explosive. It was high explosive instead of gunpowder in mortar rounds, in AK-47 7.62 things. And so we so infiltrated the communist supply system as it was coming down that they reached a point where they were terrified that when they fired an AK-47, that the bolt would actually blow back through their head. And this was when they put a round in a mortar, they didn't know if the whole mortar team would be killed because it was high explosive. It literally would go off on contact, not just be launched out of the tube. And there were things that were going on that were so amazing, like the propaganda with the strikes on their areas, where if they were having people being killed, for example, and propaganda would be left there about the inevitable victory of Ho Chi Minh and the communists, that type of thing. Why would you do that to the enemy? Because it introduced tremendous because they were heavily propagandized by PSYOPs people, by political officers, commissars. And so SOG had all of these different things going on. It was a complete psychological warfare operation. And frankly, there were some things that I won't even get into that were so improper, and the United States never does these things. But that's what black ops are for, is to do the things that were never done. Anyway, these guys did some of them.
I'll like to take a few questions for a bit before
Yeah.
we continue on, because we've got a lot of trail photos and stuff like that to get into as well. Let's see, people saying hello. First comment is, it's insane how vulnerable these aircraft were considering their assignment. Yes, that is absolutely true. Kyle says, incredible these dudes volunteer for SOG knowing without a doubt they will be hurt. Absolutely correct. Here's a very interesting one. We've got a SOG vet that's coming up next for a question, but Galil would like to know, out of all three of y'all, what was the most prized piece of intel gathered during your time flying for SOG?
Well,
There was so much of it.
yeah, the
And
photos.
they didn't normally come back and tell you what they did with it. Every now and then you'd get these comments like, well, the Secretary of Defense was very happy with that. I thought, oh, that's interesting. And by then, half the time you could only half remember which set of photos it was, because we flew so many missions. So that's a hard one to answer. There was a lot of high quality intel that came out of Fort Drum, and there were whole teams that were spared because they didn't have to be targeted against really difficult targets. So,
yeah, and we'll be showing some of them because Mr. Mike, I'm pretty sure you and Frank ended up finding some commo lines and all kinds of other stuff and some bridges. Or I'll be anxious to get into that for y'all to explain. Kyle was wondering, what did the team do if they lost communication with y'all in the air? Did they already have a time and a place to be picked up?
yes, but you'd have to realize in theory, but SOG teams in Laos and Cambodia, unless we're operating near the radio relay on Leghorn, you had no communications at all except through these guys, the aviators. You would have a morning situation rep, where an aviator would take your encoded, it was a team OK, basically. Towards evening, close of day, the teams would report in if they were in contact or what. But when you had 3 Americans and 4 to 5 indigenous tribes members on the ground in Laos or Cambodia, you had thousands of enemy troops surrounding them, looking for them. They had special units that were counter recon to find them and kill them. And if they were in contact, there was no assurance whatever of communication. That's why you had people orbiting, listening for calls, and there weren't unnecessary communications because they were good at monitoring that. So no, now they have satellite phones that work everywhere. It was routine that you could only do a morning and evening one, and after that it was a question, was Covey up, was SPAF up, and that was your chance to, because if they were, and often they were, you could bring in these F4s and A1E Sky Raiders and Cobra gunships, and they were equipped to do what we call group therapy on the North Vietnamese. Good question.
Mr. Frank, you mentioned in it's fairly early on in the book about getting out, and you're still getting used to leaving very early in the morning, how peaceful it starts, and then it could be a peaceful day full on, or it could be a very peaceful morning, and then by daylight all hell breaks loose. What was it like going from did you have a certain point? For both you and Mr. Phil, did y'all have a certain point on y'all's flight out from Khartoum, whichever direction y'all were going for that day? Did y'all have a point to where y'all knew you got to get serious because there may be guns in placement somewhere? After talking to Leghorn, because I know you mentioned you checked in with Leghorn at a certain point. When would y'all gear up and know?
Sometimes you check into Leghorn. Sometimes you check into Leghorn. You didn't always.
Okay.
And you were flying pretty much time distance heading to where your target area was. And as you began to approach, as you approached it, that's when you knuckled down, buckled down, got down on the trees, and prepared to do what you were supposed to do. Prior to that, when you were flying up at altitude, you could look out the window and you could do a little daydreaming, which I admit that I did, and do a little sightseeing, and it calmed you, and it at least calmed me. And then as I got closer, I got sort of geared up, and now I couldn't think about what I was looking out the window except for the target. And now we have to concentrate on this and only this. And that's what I mean by compartmentalization. You packed it all into one small screen and honed in on it and did what you're supposed to do. And there was no room for anything else. You didn't fly straight and level. You didn't fly straight ahead. You bobbed and weaved and held a little rudder in so you were going sideways. All these things you had to think about. So, you really didn't have time now to let your mind wander, or you die.
Mr. Phil?
Yeah, my the most I guess peaceful flights I had was, you take off from Khartoum, you go to Dak To, get some fuel, and then you head across the border. And on the missions where the first priority for the day is to make communication with the team. And just so people know, we had a little device. They called it a CAC wheel, and I don't know the spelling of it. I think it was KAK.
CHCH.
It was a code device to where we could communicate with the team on the ground in code. And so I would be flying out of small arms range and hopefully out of 51 cal range. I'd be flying up at 5,000 feet if I'm going to go to communicate with a team. I would not fly over the team. I would fly in the general area, and I would check in with them. And if I got a coded message that said "Team OK," then I relaxed for a while because I knew I wasn't going to have to orchestrate an distraction. And then I would go check on another team, same thing. And if I got a team okay, I felt pretty good, felt relaxed. And then I'd get down a bit lower, 1,000 feet above the ground or so, maybe 1,500 feet, start reconning the trail. Now, this is assuming that I did not have a photographer in my backseat. And so I just go out there and scout around. And of course, we had our sectional maps. And if we observed anything on the trail or anywhere else that appeared to be enemy activity, if you're out there by yourself, it was probably not a good idea to get down low and circle whatever you found. My modus operandi was I would fly over and I would, if I saw something, I would mark it on the map and I would keep on going just as if I didn't see it. And I would check in with the Leghorn, or when I stopped back to Dak To for fuel, check in with the CCC guys there on their but and see if there's something that we wanted to do in the way of launching some kind of an attack mission. And this is where I want to give kudos to the helicopter pilots. The guys that put the teams in, the slick drivers, the Huey slicks, not the gunships, but those guys, when they put a team into an LZ, even if we thought the LZ was safe or cold, a lot of times it was, and sometimes it wasn't. The North Vietnamese had LZ watchers out there, and any little clearing in the jungle out in Laos or Cambodia that looked like it might be an LZ, there could be a guy up in a tree on call it a deer stand or something, with his binoculars and his radio, and he would be watching to see if there was a team to be inserted into that LZ. And many times we would, when we were inserting a team, we would actually do a false insertion on a couple of different potential LZs, and then ultimately put the team in on an LZ that was not so nice. In other words, it was less desirable for the helicopter pilots. Those guys were amazing pilots. They came in there and put the teams in poor LZs or above bamboo thickets and elephant grass or whatever. And then the Charlie model gunship drivers, you know, they hung it out there too, as did the Cobra pilots when we were. The team was experiencing enemy activity and they needed to be extracted. Those guys came in and they, you know, we marked the targets and they came in low and they shot up everything that they could to help the team escape. And so I have nothing but great things to say and such admiration for the guys that flew the helicopters over there. And of course, the Air Force jockeys that flew the F-4s and the Sky Raiders, they were all amazing.
My favorite guy, the lead flight of 2 Sky Raiders, and we had a team having a problem on the ground. And so he's going through his rundown of what these 2 guys have got on board. And I mean, sometimes with a Sky Raider, I mean, it could take a year. He carried so much ordnance. And that guy went by me at 500 feet and I kind of waved at him. But this was the guy. And so at the end of his rundown, he said, and each of us have 6 rounds of 38 if you need it. And I thought that was one of the funniest damn things I'd ever heard, because the guy's loaded with minigun and he's got all kinds of nape and 250-pound, 500-pound bombs. You name it, he's hauling it. And then he's got 6 rounds of 38, which might come in handy at the very end. I thought that's just one of the funniest things I'd ever heard. But, you know, it's just one of those, it's gallows humor. I know, but it struck me as pretty funny.
Yeah. It's probably worth saying, I think we're forgetting now at maybe a Pentagon level. It helps to understand the Pentagon has nothing to do with war fighting. It's a military spending organization, really, and it doesn't like war fighting, let alone war winning. But there's never going to be a substitute for boots on the ground, for actually having people in the air and on the ground. The earlier question, drones, yes, they can do a lot of things, but human judgment is never going to be outdated. And so that was the
point I was trying to make, Michael, and that's exactly right. That's the difference between the 3 of us and a drone.
Yeah.
I mean, do y'all even see that? Not to take off topic or derail it, but do y'all see with the way drones are going, and now with artificial intelligence, I feel the same way you and Mr. Mike and Mr. Phil feel. That was weird to say, Phil. To have you're gonna have to have a man on the ground, a highly trained man on the ground, even with dare I say, AI ramping up the way it is. I mean, it'll always be great and all that, but it still seems like you're going to have a man on the ground no matter what.
I think the minute you say, for instance, and just to take this into commercial aviation for just a minute, if I ever said that the autopilot can fly the airplane better than me, I'd get off the airplane. Because you're missing a point. And if you can't fly this damn autopilot, there's something wrong with you. You shouldn't be doing what you're doing. And that in a way is the same thing here. It is this real intelligence, these real eyeballs, these real voices, as opposed to something that's not.
Mr. Mike, since you're, while we're on this subject of having humans key in so much, could you and Mr. Phil and Frank kind of talk us through a notable Ford drone, maybe what your eyes seeing what maybe a drone or something couldn't see, or picking up recognition on foot patterns, or whatever whatever y'all found?
Well, just for an example, the way the North Vietnamese army was organized for hardline communications with actual wires strung through the jungle for telecommunications purposes, only battalion-sized units had hardwire communications like that. So the question was, if you could see those hidden wires in the dense jungle. You could trace them and find battalion-sized units to be hammered by airstrikes. And the best way to see those wires, the way that it worked, was to be there at first light. This was kind of the dawn patrol for drone missions. You'd be going out at dark 30, and when the dawn came over Cambodia, for example, or over Laos with the heavy jungle, there was the light was coming down at a slant angle, and it showed you the phone lines. And when you saw those, you tracked them, and you could find the battalion size units. And then you could order up. There were F4s, F4 people, and A1E pilots. They like to blow things up. That was like a hobby for them. Was high explosive, brought on targets. So those were some. You've got photos, I think, that show, well, like this is taken with early, and you can see the wires running across. Well, when you followed those wires, which later in the day would be difficult to see with the diffused lighting, you could find important enemy locations for exploitation. And that was really, this was just another day at the office, really, for SPAF activities on the trail. And you also would find, how to put it, part of the importance of people on the ground is you need people back in headquarters who believe them. For example, at MACV, they did not want to believe that the Chinese communists, their army, the PLA, had entered the war. They refused to believe it. Didn't matter that SOG teams were saying, look, we are operating, there are Chinese officers that are now leading NVA units. It is happening. And they consistently would not believe it. This was not at SOG, you understand. This was at MACV, the overall command in Vietnam. They didn't want to believe that China was now active in the war to replace the North Vietnamese army. It had so many of their people killed that they were replacing them. And actually, they reached a point where a lot of Chinese were adopting North Vietnamese army dress and designations, but they were Chinese. And the team that I served with under Kirschbaum, we actually, although Baker was 1-0 for that one, we were able to prove that they had Chinese officers operating at the head of NVA units. And the way we could prove that is we killed them all on one of our missions in an ambush. So there's Plaster writes about that mission in the book for RT Maine. And for what this is, just a quick aside, but it goes back to the calmness that Phil and Frank were saying. In a conversation with Dave Kirschbaum, who was one of the classic 1-0s, he was an old line SF, an absolutely professional man. I talked to him many years after the war, and I said, Dave, I felt it was such an honor to serve under your leadership on RT Maine on those missions over the border. I said, I want to thank you. I said, I don't know why you gave me a chance to join RT Maine when a lot of people would have liked to. And I was a new guy from the Hatchet Force. Said, but you did. And his comment was really instructive. He says, I picked you because you were calm by nature. He says, the tensions, when there are 8 of you and 1,000 of them, and you're going to do that for anywhere from 6 to 10 days. He says, unless a person is basically calm and collected, it is unendurable, the tension that you'll experience. It had nothing to do with people being cowardly. It was just the level of stress was almost incomprehensible. And so you had to start from a standpoint, a 0 point of being fairly calm. And if you weren't that way by nature, you should be in Hatchet Force operations. They were just as brave, but there were people who did recon missions that went across one time, and when the air assets left and the utter silence closed in, you were now in Laos. and they had literally 50,000 people there who were paid. They could become rich by killing a SOG person, the bounty system on us. And just that sense of aloneness and like, don't worry, maybe at last light, an aviator will take a sit rep, and maybe in the morning they'll find out if you're still alive and in contact. That was unbearable for some of the people. It wasn't because they weren't brave. It was just a different aspect of cross-border operations. Some people were cut out for that, and others needed to do other things that were just as important. But boy, the aviators were important. Anyway.
It's hard to comprehend the amount of stress that those guys must have felt. And when you think about getting out and getting on the ground and establishing a perimeter for a moment, and all of a sudden the assets start to fly away, and the helicopters leave and the gunships leave, and then Covey leaves or we leave, and now you're by yourself.
Yeah.
And you're going to be out there until the next morning.
And they're tracking you with dogs.
Yeah.
They're highly skilled, but you could use the dogs against them, because if you did a fishhook ambush, for example, you always had to be on the downwind side of your own trail, but their dogs would lead their tracking elements into the killing zone of an ambush. You got to realize people had developed these things. The foundation of modern special ops was put together in this period by SOG. So, for example, if you were ambushing an enemy unit on the trail, people fight all the harder when they don't have any options. So it's better if you were ambushing a unit like a platoon-sized unit on the road to give them a good ditch on the other side of the road that they could scurry into and try and survive, because that took their attention away from delivering a lot of effective return fire. And when they got into the ditch, they would be basically shielded. They would be protected. Unfortunately, you had Claymore mines already set up to do group therapy on whoever was in the ditch. But there were techniques. These things were being developed as this was going. And now modern special ops still draws from what SOG had to originate. And back before us in World War II, you had Jedburgh teams, you had the British Special Operations Executive. It was people learning from other people. But during this period, there was a lot about how to work aviation assets. It all had to be figured out on the fly, you could say. And these were really creative people. And you learned, okay, this worked, that didn't work. So
Mr. Phil and Mr. Frank, I notice I'm going from Frank's book, Running Recon Again. Great book, guys. Again, if you don't have it and can find a good copy, please do. It mentions, it goes through the call signs SPAF 1 through 4. This is a bit of a two-parter, and I apologize for it. How many, when you two were at Khartoum and stationed with, I believe, Platoon 4, working with SOG, second platoon. How many SPAF men were with you at that time? How many SPAF pilots were flying?
2 to 3.
Yeah.
2 to 3.
Yeah.
Including y'all?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. But no wonder y'all were always flying. Besides doing the Ford drum and having Mr. Mike in the back seat with y'all, would Mr. Mike go along for I thought I would remember y'all being on BDAs. Did y'all have backseaters doing BDAs as well?
Yeah, somebody had to photograph it.
Okay, so he was also photographing it.
Well, you knew, as I recall the way this thing worked, you were pretty much on station just as the B-52s were finishing up.
Whoa.
And so you were right in on top of it when the last And I read, well, it was Pete Johnson that said he got all screwed up one day and went the wrong way, and he was flying away from bombs. Damn, they're going to hit him. But that's pretty much how that is. Did you recall it that way, Phil? Is that?
Well, it went both ways. If you knew in the morning that you were going out to do a bomb damage assessment from an arc light from the day before, you would have a backseater with you because you needed somebody to take pictures of the devastation and destruction that those B-52s would create. But occasionally, well, maybe once or twice that I can remember, I would be out there and I would get a radio communication that the B-52s were working or going to work a certain area, and they'd give me the coordinates, and then I would fly toward it. And I had a similar experience that Pete had. I got so close to a B-52 strike that I could see the bombs falling off of my left wing. I think I was flying to the north, and the B-52 strikes were flying from south to north. I could see the bombs falling, and you could see the devastation. And then, of course, they wanted a bomb damage assessment immediately after the strike. And I had no backseater on that particular mission. And so what I learned quickly is that when the smoke cleared and I went down to start looking for destroyed equipment or bodies or whatever, I learned that whatever was left on the ground in the way of live people, they were really pissed. And, they were everything from AK-47s to 12.7s, anything that wasn't blown up was coming up at me. And interestingly enough, I never took a hit during that particular run, and so all I could do was report on what I saw, and it's hard for someone who's never seen the results of a B-52 strike to comprehend. I think Mike had referred to it earlier as a moonscape. Mm-hmm. Yeah, those B-52s come in, and normally the strikes that I observed, the B-52s were flying. It'd be a 3-ship mission, and they'd be flying in an echelon. And I can't remember the size of the impact areas, but they were probably a quarter mile wide by a mile or two long. Mm-hmm. And everything on the ground in that area was obliterated, except if it was a bunker area or whatever that was being bombed. Of course, the NVA would dive into the bunkers and hide during the strike, and then a bird dog or a covey meaning an Air Force pilot probably flying an O2 push-pull Skymaster, would go down to do the bomb damage assessment. And that was, next to the 4-drum low-level photo missions, BDAs were probably, in my opinion, the most dangerous missions, because like I say, when the smoke cleared and a bird dog went down there to start looking for equipment and bodies or whatever, soldiers that were left were not in a good mood, and they'd already been discovered, so they had no fear of shooting at you. So that was my experience with B-52 strikes, and like I say, I only witnessed 2 or 3 of them actually happening, but it was something else.
I did more than a few. Very many of them I was by myself, and I absolutely agree with you, Phil. That just sucked. You got down jitting around in the weeds, and guys were coming up, and you didn't know how the hell they survived it. And now they're everything they could. They'd throw a rocket ship, if nothing else. Mm-hmm. I mean, they were just that pissed off. And I thought this one is going to kill me. This thing, the photos I were crappy, but goddamn BDAs, I was sure that I was not coming back, especially when I was by myself. I said, I really don't want to do this, but
That's a comment from a CCC Hatchet Force vet, Mr. Terry, watching with us. He's gone in on a few BDAs, and they were nasty. They were like a stirred up hornet's nest.
Yeah. It's probably good to say something about our opponents in the war, the North Vietnamese army, because we were up against a really serious army. They were well trained, they were well equipped, they were highly disciplined troops that did their work well. And when you fought them on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, these were not beginners or anything like that. They actually had some first-rate people there in our counter recon companies were put together especially to fight SOG operations. And sometimes I think in the popular culture is the idea, well, there's a skinny old man on a bicycle with a backpack of rice, and the whole B-52 raid was here, and he'd give the finger, and all of that was nonsense. The North Vietnamese army was very well laid out, very well equipped. Their anti-aircraft system was one of the best in the world. And, you could see, because we had indicators that told us when they were firing, and they were called tracers. Their tracers were lime green. Ours were red orange. Every now and then I've talked to somebody, they love to tell you about their horror stories or whatever. And they say, oh, I remember these night fire with the tracers coming at us. And I say, oh, what color were they? I said, red. I said, that's nice. Because no, we use the red and they use the green. But yeah, the people that we fought, they were very effective, disciplined troops. Didn't mean they weren't savage. Like if they had caught any of us, your death would not have been a nice one, believe me. And they did sometimes do some really bad things.
Jason, I can't think of, most of the time I had somebody in the back of the airplane with me. When I went out by myself, I hated that because I was, if something happened, then what? I'm by myself and I don't know the first thing about running around on the ground. He did, Buckland. So if we went down, I was following him. I don't think flying by myself doing a BDA was probably one of the worst things I ever had to do. But that didn't happen that often, thank God.
Mr. Phil, were you alone a lot, or?
The sequence of the mission changed a bit while I was there. It seems like the first 2 or 3 months I was there with S.O.G, with CCC, I was spending more time supporting the teams.
Yeah.
Searching for LZs, inserting the teams, covering the teams, extracting the teams, bringing in air assets when the teams got in trouble. And then later on, it seems like I was doing more low-level photo work as the mission changed. As Frank said, they were the folks back in the Pentagon were thinking that rather than sending so many teams out and putting them at risk, why not use aircraft and cameras to find the enemy and mark their locations to bring in the air assets.
Yep.
And yeah, I don't know if that's me or Frank, but you can see the little bird dog down there flying over the bomb craters and a footpath, which is undoubtedly part of the trail.
Yeah.
And, that bird dog is probably flying, I don't know, maybe 20, 30 feet off the ground, which was pretty high if you were flying a photo mission. You wanted to get lower so you could see under the trees. If you could see under the canopy, you could find stuff, bridges and hooches and equipment better than if you were flying over the trees, because a lot of the terrain out there was triple canopy, and you just really couldn't see through it. And Bucky and I actually flew a couple of missions where we saw people on the ground, running down the trail, and we'd hang out the window. I'd use my knees to steer the airplane, the stick, and we'd be hanging out the window with our CAR-15s, shooting at people on the ground. And there's a couple of photos that went in that SOG coffee table book that were photos that Mike took out of my airplane.
You remember when the Marine showed up, Phil, when we were flying that guy around with no uniform on, but I think it was in the Marine Corps.
Yeah, I flew with a Marine Corps photographer.
Yeah.
And he was in my back seat the same day that you witnessed that F4 going in.
Yep.
I was probably flying high ship that day, and there was a lot of bridges down there in that area.
Yeah.
And
he and I, go ahead. Sorry.
Go ahead. Yeah, there was a lot of bridges down there in that area, and this particular F4 pilot, there was a pair of them that came in to work on the bridges that I saw in this fairly narrow valley at the base of a fairly steep hill. And I think the F4 got target fixation. I mean, that's my opinion.
That's what I thought.
Because if there was ever a definition of being behind the power curve, that was one of those where you could see him go in and you could see him pickle his bombs, and he kept going, and then you saw the nose come up, but the aircraft is still going down.
Yeah.
And he's got the burners going, but he went into the bridge. I mean, he went right into the side of the mountain. That was the end of that F4 and that pilot. I had that. But they were good. Those F4 and F100 drivers. They came in and did their jobs well, and the Skyraider guys were even
better,
more accurate with their missions. I mean, I can remember a couple where the teams would call me in and say, "Hey, we've got enemy activity. They're chasing us, and they're 50 to 100 meters away from us." And I would bring the A1Es in. I would mark the targets, and I'd say, "Guys, dive into a ditch, get in a hole, get behind a tree, something, because these guys are coming in with napalm first. And when you see those A1s in come in and release those napalm canisters, hold your breath, because there's not going to be anything to breathe for a few seconds, because that napalm sucks the air right out of the air, sucks the air out of the atmosphere." And they could, the team guys could feel the heat, and then the A1Es would drop their 250 pounders, and then they'd come, or their cluster bombs, whatever they happen to have with them at that time. Then they'd come in and strafe. And, I helped a couple of teams, get out of the danger zone by basically having A1E drivers, killing the guys that were after them. And that's pretty gratifying when that happens.
Yep.
Maureen and I were coming into my back seat, and I forget, we were in Laos, and we were over a section of the trail was more like a road than anything else I'd ever seen. And I'm down probably 60 feet, 50 feet off the ground, fly in the contours of the road, and come around this turn, and here comes a company of NVA, and they had scarves on, little red scarves, I remember, and they were marching. And I don't know how they didn't hear me, but I sure as hell just went, "Oh, wow." And all of a sudden, everybody just went in different directions, and there must have been spider holes or ditches or someplace, because those guys literally disappeared. And he was taking photographs as fast as he could, but I don't know that we got anything. But I'd never ever seen anything like that. But they were marching. They had a flag, and their unit flag or whatever it was, and I thought, that, my God, they really are down there.
Well, a lot of people that hear about the Ho Chi Minh Trail, they think it was a trail. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was actually a network of roads and trails and creeks and rivers and ditches and footpaths. And, there was just, I don't even know. I mean, the trail went from north to south, and it came into South Vietnam in many places. But the trail was a huge network, and we're looking at I think we're looking at raw there. The trail was a huge network of trails, actually. And that's why it was so hard to stop movement down the trail, is if air assets came in and blew up a part of the trail, there were probably trucks and bulldozers parked not too far away that during the night they would come in and repair the road and rebuild the bridges, and the troops would be using the trail again the next day.
And these people the NVA were absolute masters of camouflage. They had to be. So they had to have bridges across the streams. And in Cambodia, there were a fair amount of streams. So they would build bridges across the streams. And the bridges might be 3 to 4 inches underwater. And with silty water, how do you know that the bridge is there? You had to say, okay, well, there's a trail coming here, or it has trucks capability, and there's on the other side, there has to be a bridge there, but you can't see it in dirty water. And the trucks can drive across the water. And bear in mind, the drivers did not start up at the north and drive all the way to the south. They went maybe 10 to 12 miles at the most. And then the trucks went on with other drivers, so they intimately knew every inch of the route, and they could drive it with just yellow fog lights at night. These were pretty serious people.
Right there that I can't remember if this is Mr. Mike or Pete Johnson, but
I think
y'all,
Pete Johnson took that photo, yeah,
okay.
from his bird.
And then there's a few of Mr. Ted. Folks were wondering about not only in cabin, so to speak, your gear, but also your armaments for the bird dog, because I know you also had some flechettes besides the marking targets, white phosphorus that you would use. What was the armament for Mr. Phil and Frank for the airplane, and would y'all have your CAR-15 and M16 in the cockpit with you? And Mr. Mike, would you normally carry a load with you as well? God forbid y'all hit the ground.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I can only speak for myself. I had a Covey pilot buddy at Lake Hoover Air Force Base, and I think when I first started flying missions in Vietnam, we had this leg pack that we wore that was survival gear, and eventually I got an Air Force survival vest that had all kinds of pouches in it, and I carried a survival radio. I carried my 38 in a shoulder holster, 6 rounds in it and another dozen rounds. I carried my CAR-15, and Bucky would remember in my back seat, I had a Claymore mine pouch that you carried a Claymore mine in with no Claymore in it. And I had mine full of 20-round magazines that were taped together, one right side up, the other upside down. So, my CAR-15 had plenty of ammo with me to use in the CAR-15 if I needed it. And I had pen gun flares and, a fishing kit and a survival knife, K-bar survival knife. I had all kinds of stuff with me that went with me every single day on every mission, just in case, I had to go down. My theory was if I had a backseater and he was equipped with his CAR-15 and plenty of rounds of ammunition, and maybe he snuck a couple of hand grenades in the mix. We weren't supposed to carry hand grenades with us inside the aircraft, but some did. And I even had John Myers's sawed-off M79 grenade launcher that I carried with me quite often, and I had a couple of spare rounds in a patch in a flight vest. I never shot that thing out the window like John did, because he, you know, he shot it out the window of his bird dog, holding it with one hand, and the thing kicked so hard it kicked his thumb up against the top of the open window, and I don't know if it broke his thumb or whatever, but
It broke it.
bandaged up for a couple of days. But no, we were well equipped in our bird dogs with armament. I flew in my flak vest. There you go. That's the survival vest that that gentleman is wearing. You can see all the pouches on it. I wore a flak vest most of the time. Well, some of the time. It depended on the mission, because a lot of times I sat on my flak vest, because usually if you're flying over a target and somebody's shooting at you, the bullet would come up, through the floor, hopefully. And if you were sitting on a flak vest, maybe it would save your ass, so to speak. But I only had one round come up through the floor that I remember, and I was flying a Vietnamese special forces team leader out. No, he wasn't a team leader. He was not sure his position, but his team was in trouble in northern Cambodia, and I flew over the team and they were being chased by NVA, and they were in a box canyon, hard to escape, and I was just, we were hanging out the window firing our CAR-15s, and a bullet came up through the bottom of my aircraft. I didn't know it at the time, but it went into the battery, and I could smell it, and I thought I was on fire. So after I thought I had some kind of electrical fire, but after we hosed down the bad guys, and the team got away, I flew back to Khartoum and found out that the only damage to my aircraft was the battery acid flowing around back there, stinking up the place. But that team got away, and that particular Vietnamese Special Forces backseater that I had, they wrote me up for something. I don't remember what it was, but I got an award for that. That happened to Frank a few times too. He got his DFC and Air Medals and Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry and all of that.
All that. And I did the same thing you did, carrying what I carried, and sat on my flak vest and had a parachute on my back, which I never put on because we weren't high enough to jump.
What would be the point? You couldn't use it.
Yeah. So it just sat back there hoping it would stop something. And but other than the two rockets under each wing, the airplane was essentially unarmed and unprotected, except for what we carried. And the CAR-15s were bungeed against the right-hand door. I carried a 38. The only difference is that I carried 2 rounds of 38, but the bullets were in the pocket of my flight suit, and I saved those for me.
I remember when Jerry Ford was the platoon leader. Jerry was a good guy from Alabama. I don't think he's ever left Alabama, right? He's still there. Jerry is. Yep. Good man, Charles, Frank calls him. But we had a conversation. Some of these things stick out in your mind. Jerry and I were talking down at the Headhunters place at Khartoum Airfield, and he just looked at me and says, "You do realize, of course, that we don't know zip about what to do if we're on the ground in Laos, shot down. We are completely dependent on you. What is your plan for escape and evasion?" I just looked at him and said, "Well, it's all thought out. First, we have to collect all the resources from the downed airplane. Then we have to start moving without leaving a trail. And we're going to have to be heading west." He looked at me and says, "Why would you want to go west? That makes no sense at all." I said, "That is why you don't do what they expect you to do. You go in the wrong direction because their search efforts for the crew they'll try and interdict you from making for the Annamese Cordillera, the fence, the famous fence and such. So we have to go in the wrong direction, and then we'll wait until they get bored. And that's when you call for an extraction, maybe the next day. But so there was actually a plan in place, but that's where it helped to have run recon and done hatchet force missions, etc. Because aviators are out of their element once you get on the ground in a place like that. And SOG teams had to figure this all out. For example, when they were tracking you, if you could get in behind their tracking elements and just track them, they never figured that out. Because even if they had dogs, the dogs would start leading them in circles and they take the dogs offline because this is pointless. Why are they? Well, because the Americans are now behind them and following them as they follow the Americans, and it just becomes a spiral, and it would give up their tracking efforts. Either that, or you could just shoot them, which was a fairly sincere form of criticism.
So
go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt, Mr. Frank.
no, you go. It's getting late. I just wanted to point that out.
Okay. I was gonna show. We're gonna end up having to have all of y'all back on again because we've got so much information to cover. We've got a few questions here. I wanted to hop in since people were gracious enough. This is a sad subject, but in the career of the SPAF men, how many SPAF were lost?
I thought we lost 5, as I counted them.
You talking about aircraft or people?
KIAs, yes, sir. Men. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember three of us that were lost, but there was a couple of more aircraft that were lost because I remember the young warrant officer that flew his very first SPAF mission.
Jeff Bales.
Jeff Bales, yeah. Jeff flew his very first mission across the fence, got shot down on his very first mission. Fortunately, he had a Special Forces observer in his back seat. Yeah, that's a picture of his airplane. And they escaped from the wreckage and they got picked up and brought back to Doc Toe. And Jeff went into became our maintenance officer down at Camp Holloway and didn't fly any SPAF missions anymore. And so it does happen. And we lost Bruce Besser and his observer. We never found him or the airplane or anything. And we lost George Aiken. Well, he wasn't a SPAF though, but yeah. And I don't know about CCS and CC and how many.
Well, what about Frank Wise?
Was Roger flying SPAF? We lost Pisacreta.
He was for a while. I think he was probably lost after he stopped and went back to play coup. Because you didn't keep lists of things. People were always being lost and there wasn't a lot of attention. You didn't want to focus on that and keep lists or anything. So let me just say for my part in closing, when your viewers look at Phil Phillips and Frank Doherty, what they are seeing on their screen are surviving American heroes. And this is important for their families to know what these men did, because day after day, they put their life on the line, taking on risks that most people could barely imagine. And to do that one time is a big thing, but to do it day after day after day, that's what you're looking at here, folks, are American heroes. There's 2 of them over there on the right side of the screen. And this country was built by people like that. It was built by people in blue jeans, not people in 3-piece suits with laser bloody pointers and whatnot that, teach their college classes with their effeminate ways or whatever. So thank you for what you did. Thank you.
Well, don't forget the guys that were on the ground at SOG. I mean, Bucky, you were on your third tour. I mean, these guys, these 1-0s and and the other Americans that were on the teams and the Mountain Yard fighters that were with them, these guys were incredible soldiers. And you talk about guts, going out into Laos and Cambodia, 8 or 10 man teams for 6 to 10 days at a time. You know, I can't even comprehend that.
I can't either. And I used to think, well, geez, we were there every day, and these guys go out and they come back and they train a little bit, then they go back out again. But it occurred to me, and actually Mike and I talked about it, that, as I said, I can't imagine what it must have been like to hear things fly away, and now you're by yourself, and you have no guarantee that the sun's going to be out tomorrow. It could be socked in overcast, and nobody's coming. And all these things have got to weigh on the guys who are running around down there. And I cannot imagine the stress, because I know how I felt, but I can't imagine what they must have felt. That's why you can't ever get mad at Glasshauser. No matter what he did, you never get mad at Glasshauser. So
I agree, and I say that about all three of you. Every time I speak to Mr. Mike or any of the recon men, I don't even understand how they don't didn't pass out from fear, because the moment I would have gotten to the aircraft, I would have had to have gone to the bathroom. I would have just fallen apart getting out there. I mean, all of y'all are men beyond men. I just undescribable.
Well, part of it was the humor and the off the wall thing. And the commanders, if they were smart, and a lot of them were very savvy, they knew to leave people alone to do off the wall things. Phil, you were guilty of probably the most off the wall things of the aviators. But just as an example, I won't mention who it was, because it was a felony not committed by Phil, which was distinctive. But one day, Sergeant Howard of Recon Company, who was America's most decorated soldier, amazing man, ended up an SF colonel. In the presence of Recon Company formation, he says, "Sergeant so-and-so, you and your team, you see that 3/4 ton truck full of explosives? Take it out to the yard camp range and blow it up. They're outdated." He says, "Okay, Sergeant Howard." So that team later comes in. They hitch a ride back to the camp from the yard camp a few clicks down the road. And Howard's there, and he says, "Okay, well, where's the truck?" And they just smiled and said, "Sergeant Howard, in the presence of dozens of witnesses, you told us to take that truck full of explosives to the yard camp and blow it up." He says, "This is a joke, right? You didn't actually blow the truck up." I said, "Yes, it was really fun. We have pictures." Now, this is a felony destruction of government property intentionally.
Federal.
People did things like that because it was funny.
it was,
And they thought, well, we can steal another truck next week. Okay. Somebody won't need one that they're using. But there was a place for that. And there was a place for some smart commanders who knew when to leave pilots and SF guys alone and not bring charges. Colonel Apt in that was an exceptional officer.
Yeah.
He was so highly respected. He later would be succeeded by a few people that were not respected. But Apt was just an exceptional man.
Well, in a future podcast, I suppose we could tell the story about Grand Theft, which was a nickname that Frank gave me for an event that took place, and Bucky knows what I'm talking about too. But anyway, we'll talk about that some other time.
There are more stories.
And you're entitled to have your lawyer present, Phil.
Okay.
Absolutely. I'm going to show one y'all's. I believe this is one of y'all's early reunions, and we'll shut it down. But I wanted to show this. This is one of the earlier.
That's Richie Kane, and that next to Richie is Chuck Slimowitz, John Myers, my beloved Arlie Deaton, Don Ship, another great guy. This guy's a coke dealer, and that's me. That's George Savani, the guy that's Bernie Bernardson. This is the finest officer that ever walked the face of the earth. This is John Pappas, the best. And this is John Estel, another really lovely guy. I think this may have been the first reunion, this one. And that's George Savani. Did I say that? The guy in the end, George Savani? Yeah. And I think we were down in Annapolis at this. It was great.
Wow.
It was
we're
great.
standing in front of the wall there.
Yes, we are.
Oh.
And what was so cool was we had the wreath and it was a very emotional time. And then we started to talk among ourselves and then we started to laugh. And some woman came over, she said, "Y'all are being disrespectful." No, we're not. No, this is ours. It's ours. And I thought, yike, oh well.
Mhm.
Anyhow.
And you realize that the wall, that monument that's so beautifully done, the U.S. government refused to, they gave the land, but they would not put up $1 for it. They said that nobody would want a memorial to the American War in Vietnam. And it actually became far and away the most visited place in Washington, D.C. But the government didn't want to even contribute to a memorial for its veterans. When we do get together, ask these rascals to tell about their nice dinner at the Navy Officers Club up in Da Nang. And
Hang on, I'm
You
taking notes
left
here.
that out of your book. How could you do that?
I wrote that and I had it included. And not the woman that I hired to do the editing for me, but my two agents said that it did not add to this. And I thought that's bullshit. But you know what? I have to say they had the experience in dealing with authors and what should and what should not be there. And I think they missed the boat on that.
That was a good story.
I was surprised that you didn't put in the low-level pass down the street in Cambodia for Prince Sihanouk.
Michael, I'd be absolutely honest with you. That was pretty early on when I went to work at CCC. That scared the living crap out of me. And I sort of totally forgot about it until you brought it up. And I thought, Jesus, did I do that? Yes. Whose idea was that?
Well, we flew a couple of these crazy missions deep into Laos, all the way over to the Mekong River. I have no clue why we were doing that, but Frank knows who ordered those stupid missions. Bucky, maybe you could, at the next time, tell us what the hell we were doing out there and why.
I could. And in fact, I could tell you a story when the U.S. State Department decided to order up a mission through S.O.G, and only the State Department, with all of its nonsense, could do it. That's a whole story in itself, and it's about how things happen at high levels in wars. So
I'm up for doing this again anytime you guys want.
Yeah, guys, already you can see this has been a great interview, but we've got to have them back, just the BS back and forth. This is wonderful. So
we did this for two freaking hours.
It flies. Wow. I told you when it's fun like this, it flies, and everybody's saying you've got to get them back. So if y'all would come back, we would love to have y'all back.
Come on.
I enjoyed it, and it was so great to hear Bucky's voice.
Yeah,
and, I see and hear too much from Frank, but Bucky, it was good to hear from you, buddy.
You too, Phil. And also, we need to talk about in Bangkok, there was the Opera Hotel, and Special Forces always stayed at the Opera Hotel. And I organized a trip for these rascals, and maybe Jerry was there too. Took them over to Bangkok and introduced them, because you were only welcome at the Opera Hotel if you were spoken for. but we're there. And so that was a wonderful trip to Bangkok. And so that was a neat story in itself, too. Happy birthday, bud.
Thank
Happy
you,
birthday,
sir.
bud.
Thank you. I'm taking notes for next time, so
Okay.
we're
Thanks,
definitely
Bud. I
going.
appreciate your hard work on this.
Thank y'all
Thank
for
you,
joining
guys.
us.
Thank
And
you.
See you next time.
See you
yes,
next
sir.
Thank you all for all of the listeners for taking
Yep.
the time.
Yep. Thanks, guys.
Thank y'all. And the show, guys, again, y'all can exit as you please. I'm closing out the show and I'll be in
Okay.
touch. But I'm gonna promote the book. Guys, again, if y'all if y'all want to read more and hear some of this amazing humor and amazing missions, y'all need to get Mr. Frank's book, Only the Light Moves.
Every word is true. Every word is true, especially the stuff about him.
Oh, I can also vouch from hearing you tell me a few that they're in there. So guys, this has been great, and absolutely, y'all have seen we're getting them back. So y'all have a blessed day, and thank y'all so
Frank,
much
your
for
nose is growing.
Oh, well.
Good to see you, Phil and Frank.
Adios, guys.
See y'all later.